Imagine this. You're walking down the street and someone approaches from the other direction. Without thinking, you make a quick judgment about who they are, what they might be like, whether you feel safe or uneasy. But here's the question. Where does that judgment come from? Is it based on personal experience? Something you saw in the news? A stereotype you didn't even realize was sitting in the back of your mind? The truth is, bias is part of how our brains work. Our minds categorize information, helping us to make sense of the world quickly. But sometimes those categories lead to assumptions that are incomplete, unfair, or even downright harmful. Welcome to the roots of racism, bias, prejudice, and systemic oppression. I'm Dr. Tajuddeen Williams, and over the next 8 weeks, we'll take a deep dive into the social psychology of racism, how bias is formed, how it's reinforced, and most importantly, how we can challenge and dismantle it.
A new report suggests some of the nation's biggest companies are discriminating against black job applicants. In the largest...
They talk about police brutality all the time. Just briefly looked at it, I'm like, damn, they killed another brother. And kind of just clicked out the message.
This is not new, this has been happening, this has been going on.
Let me see your hands.
Damn, man.
Stay in the car. Let me see your other hand.
I'm sorry.
Let me see your other hand.
Please,
Both hands.
do nothing.
Put your hands up right now. Let me see your other hand.
Bias isn't just about personal opinions. It's about systems, policies, laws, media, and cultural norms that shape how we interact with one another. It's about why a resume with the name Emily gets 50% more callbacks than one with Lakeisha when the qualifications are identical. It's about why, in the 1930s, banks labeled predominantly black neighborhoods as high risk, a practice called redlining that still impacts wealth disparities today. It's about how we decide who belongs, who deserves what, and who we fear.
So here we are again, talking about how crazy it is that when a mass shooter or a bomber is white, the media jumps to call him a lone gunman or blame mental issues. But if he's brown or Muslim or anything else, boom, terrorist. I'm not race baiting here, nor am I saying what's being committed by brown people isn't terrorism, but the disparity of the coverage is a fact. Terror attacks perpetrated by Muslims got 449% more media coverage than when the perpetrator is of any other faith. I really wanted to make a video about America's obsession with guns, but this is eating me alive here. And can we just please quit the hypocrisy? I mean, President Trump, really, man?
I think that mental health is your problem here.
You made it easier for people with mental health issues to buy guns. And then you say mental health is the problem. When Sayfullo Saipov mows down 8 people in a Manhattan truck attack, we're talking about the death penalty and ending immigration and how this isn't the right time to be politically correct. Contrast that with President Trump's tweets to the survivors of the Las Vegas attack, giving them his warmest condolences and sympathies. And now when 26-year-old Devin Patrick Keeley shoots up a Texas church during Sunday service, you just jump the gun and say,
The mental health is your problem here.
As a Muslim, I'm tired of this double standard. Do you know the first thing that I thought of when I heard about the Texas shooting? Please, Allah, don't let this guy be a Muslim. How is that an acceptable reaction? And why do we as ethnic and religious minorities have to distance ourselves from crazy people every time somebody who looks like us or sounds like us or has the same name as us commits a crime? It's exhausting. I want to grieve the dead, not jump into defense mode every time a Muslim commits a crime, nor lament how the media's coverage is totally different when a white person commits a similar crime.
This isn't ancient history. This is now. And the way we understand and talk about bias today affects real people's lives. So, what are we actually talking about when we say bias? How is prejudice different from discrimination? And what does racism actually mean beyond just individual actions? This week, we'll break down these concepts and explore some of the biggest psychological theories that explain why we think the way we do. We'll also look at the difference between explicit and implicit bias, what we say out loud versus what we may not even realize we believe. And most importantly, we'll start examining our own perspectives. I'll be asking you to take the implicit association test, more on that later, and reflect on how bias may show up in ways you never expected. I want you to pause for a second and think about a time when you were surprised by your own thoughts. Maybe you met someone and assumed something about them, only to later realize you were completely wrong. Or maybe you've noticed how certain people are treated differently in a store, at work, or in school. See, these just aren't isolated moments. They're patterns. They shape how we move through the world, how the world sees us. This course isn't just about learning facts. It's about learning to see, really see, the forces that shape our everyday interactions. So here's my challenge to you for this week. Start noticing. Pay attention to the assumptions you make, the media you consume, and the way bias operates in conversations around you. Because understanding bias is the first step towards changing it. Let's get started. Have you ever made a snap judgment about someone without even realizing it? Maybe you felt uneasy around a stranger, or maybe you assumed someone's intelligence, behavior, or skills based on their background. These subtle, automatic judgments aren't always intentional, but they reveal something powerful. Bias is everywhere, and it affects how we see the world. But what exactly is bias? And how does it differ from prejudice or discrimination? Well, let's break it down. Before we dive deeper, let's clarify three terms that often get mixed up: prejudice, bias, and discrimination. Prejudice is an attitude. It's a prejudgment we make about a group before we even know them as individuals. If someone believes that women aren't as good at math as men, that's not prejudice. It's an assumption, not necessarily an action. Bias is the tendency to favor one group over another, sometimes without even realizing it. A teacher may unknowingly call on male students more often than female students in a STEM class. That's bias in action. Discrimination is when prejudice or bias turns into action. When people are treated unfairly because of their race, gender, religion, or another characteristic. If a landlord refuses to rent to someone because of their ethnicity, that's discrimination. Think about a time when you may have witnessed or experienced bias? How did it make you feel? Now that we understand bias, let's talk about the difference between implicit and explicit bias. Explicit bias is easy to spot. It's when people openly express prejudice. Think about segregation laws in the past, or a company refusing to hire someone based on race or gender. These are deliberate, conscious forms of bias. Now, implicit bias, on the other hand, is unconscious. It's the small automatic judgments we make without realizing it. And the tricky thing, even the most well-intentioned people have implicit bias. In a well-known study, researchers sent out identical resumes, changing only the names. Resumes with names like Emily and Greg got 50% more callbacks than those with names like Lakeisha and Jamal. This wasn't explicit racism. Hiring managers weren't consciously rejecting people of color, but their unconscious biases made them perceive white-sounding names as more qualified. Have you ever experienced or noticed a situation where someone was treated differently due to a name, an accent, or appearance? So why do we form biases in the first place? Two key social psychological theories help explain this: social identity theory and realistic conflict theory. Social identity theory says that we naturally categorize people into groups, us versus them. We favor our in-group, and sometimes we see the out-group as different, inferior, or even threatening. Think about how sports fans identify with their team. If you're a Lakers fan, you probably don't have great things to say about Celtics fans. This is social identity theory in action. Realistic conflict theory suggests that when two groups compete for limited resources, hostility arises. Bias and prejudice become more pronounced when people feel their access to jobs, education, or housing is threatened. For example, during economic recessions, there is often an increase in negative attitudes towards immigrant groups as people fear job competition. Can you think of a situation where groups were in conflict over resources? How did that shape the way they viewed each other? Bias and prejudice aren't just personal beliefs. They're shaped by history, psychology, and the society we live in. Now that we've explored these definitions, let's examine how bias plays out in real-world scenarios, sometimes in ways we don't even notice. Let's take a moment to consider these two headlines. Both are describing protests, yet the language used is strikingly different. Why do you think that is? This isn't just about choice of words. It reflects deeply ingrained biases in media, society, and within ourselves. We've talked about prejudice, bias, and discrimination in theoretical terms. But how do these ideas show up in the real world? In this section, we'll look at 3 powerful case studies that demonstrate the very real consequences of bias, from hiring discrimination to wrongful convictions to racial profiling by law enforcement. Now let's start with a study that reveals how bias operates even when we think we're being objective. Hiring decisions. In a landmark study, researchers sent out identical resumes, to hundreds of employers. The only difference? The names. What do you think happened? Applicants with white-sounding names, like Emily, received 50% more callbacks than those with black-sounding names, like Lakeisha, despite having the same qualifications. Think about what that means for someone searching for a job. This isn't just about individual prejudice. It's about how systemic biases operate beneath the surface, shaping real-life opportunities.
In New York City this morning, a jogger is fighting for her life after a brutal attack in Central Park.
Viciously battered and unconscious, wearing only a jogging bra, her hands tied over her mouth.
The suspects are 14 and 15-year-olds who blazed a nighttime trail of terror.
Assaulting an elderly man, attacking a male runner, hitting another person with a lead pipe. At one time, the group was running in a pack of more than 25 youths.
The victim is now in critical condition at Metropolitan Hospital.
2 skull fractures, a significant loss of blood, and advanced hypothermia.
If she lives, it's likely she'll suffer from brain damage.
8 suspects were arraigned this weekend, aged 14 to 17.
Some of the young men told police they were just out wilding.
Wilding is a word you won't find in Webster's.
Wilding. New York City police say that's new teenage slang for rampaging and wolf packs, attacking people just for the fun of it.
The district attorney's office says that the teenagers have confessed. The spokesman said some of those confessions are on videotape.
A woman jogging and Central Park. Central Park was holy. If it had happened anyplace else other than Central Park, it would have been terrible. But it would not have been as terrible. It was, for everybody, not just me, the crime of the century.
Now let's talk about a devastating example of bias in action, the case of the Central Park Five. In 1989, 5 Black and Latino teenagers were accused of a brutal attack in Central Park. Despite having no physical evidence linking them to the crime, and despite inconsistent confessions, they were convicted and sentenced to years in prison. The media labeled them as thugs, savages, and even animals. Years later, DNA evidence proved they were innocent. So why were they convicted in the first place? Because of implicit bias. Law enforcement and prosecutors assumed their guilt simply because of their race. This case isn't just history, it's a warning about how racial bias, especially in the criminal justice system, can ruin lives. Now let's look at another form of bias, one that directly affects people's daily lives: racial profiling by law enforcement. In New York City's stop and frisk program, officers were given wide latitude to stop pedestrians, search them, and question them without needing evidence of a crime. What do you think happened? Data revealed that the vast majority of stops, nearly 90%, were of Black and Latino men, even though they made up a fraction of the city's population. And here's the kicker: 90% of those stopped were found innocent, yet they were still subjected to humiliation, fear, and criminal suspicion simply because of racial bias. So what's the takeaway? Bias isn't just an abstract concept. It has tangible, harmful effects on people's lives, careers, and safety. These 3 cases show us that bias isn't just about personal opinions. It's embedded in our systems and structures. So let's take a moment to reflect. Did any of these examples surprise you? Why or why not? How might bias show up in your own workplace, school, or social circles? What are some ways we can challenge these biases when we see them? Understanding bias is just the first step. The next step is recognizing it within ourselves, and that's what we'll focus on next. In the next section, we'll take the implicit association test together to uncover some of our own hidden biases. You might be surprised by what you find. Let's dive in. Now that we've explored the roots of bias and prejudice, let's take this conversation a step further. Let's make it personal. You may be thinking, I don't have biases. I treat everyone equally. But here's the thing. Bias isn't just about what we consciously believe. It's also about the unconscious associations our brains make without us even realizing it. And today, we're going to test that. The implicit association test, or IAT, was developed by social psychologists to measure unconscious biases. The test works by flashing words and images on the screen, and you have to quickly categorize them. It might pair words like good or bad with images of faces belonging to different racial groups. Your reaction time is measured, and here's the key. If your brain takes even a fraction of a second longer to associate certain groups with positive words, that suggests an implicit bias. This doesn't mean you're racist. It doesn't mean you're a bad person. What it does mean is that we've all absorbed messages from our surroundings, our families, schools, media, and culture. The goal isn't guilt. The goal is awareness. Think about it. When we see black men in news reports, how are they often framed? Are they business owners, doctors, and leaders? Or are they more frequently shown in mugshots linked to crime or in some kind of controversy? These subtle messages shape the way we think, even if we don't realize it. All right, now it's your turn. You can take the IAT at home on Harvard's website, and I'll walk you through the steps now, and I encourage you to take it right after this lecture. Go to implicit.harvard.edu. Click on Take a Test. Choose the race IAT. Follow the instructions and don't overthink your answers. The key is to respond quickly and instinctively. The test isn't measuring your conscious thoughts. It's measuring your knee-jerk reactions. If it takes you longer to associate certain faces with positive words, that's your unconscious bias at work. And here's something interesting. Research shows that even people of color often have biases against their own racial group. That's because implicit bias isn't just about personal experiences. It's about the messages we've all been exposed to in society. Once you've taken the test, I want you to sit with your results for a moment. Ask yourself, were you surprised by the results? Why or why not? Do you think these biases impact the way you see the world? What's one way you can challenge your own biases moving forward. Now, I know this can be uncomfortable, but self-awareness is powerful. Acknowledging bias is not about shame. It's about learning how to think critically about the messages we've absorbed and how we act moving forward. The good news? Bias isn't set in stone. Research shows that when we become aware of our biases, we can start changing the way we think and behave. Small, intentional steps like questioning stereotypes, expanding our social circles, and consuming diverse media can have a profound effect. Your challenge? Take the IAT and write a short reflection in your journal or discussion group. What surprised you? What will you do differently moving forward? So, are you ready to challenge yourself? Your biases don't define you. What you do next does. By now, we've explored how bias forms, how it affects our perceptions, and how it plays out in society. But here's the big question. What can we do about it? How do we actually reduce bias, not just in others, but in ourselves? Today, we'll go through 4 evidence-based strategies to challenge and unlearn bias. And before you start thinking, well, I don't have any biases, remember? Bias isn't a moral failing. It's a cognitive shortcut that our brains use to process information quickly. The goal isn't to eliminate bias completely, because that's impossible, but rather to recognize it, to challenge it, and reduce its influence on our decisions. The first and most crucial step in awareness: we can't fix a problem we don't acknowledge. Implicit biases often operate below the surface, shaping our reactions before we even realize it. That's why self-reflection is key. A great way to start is by paying attention to your gut reactions. Ask yourself, do I instinctively trust certain people over others? Do I make assumptions based on someone's name, appearance, or background? These aren't easy questions, but they're necessary ones. Here's a challenge. Over the next week, try noticing your snap judgments in everyday situations. When you meet someone new, when you watch the news, when you interact with coworkers, pause and ask yourself, where did this perception come from? Is it based on personal experience, or is it something I've absorbed from society? Media shapes our reality, sometimes in ways we don't even notice. Studies show that racial bias in media influences how we perceive crime, leadership, and even basic traits like trustworthiness. If all we see in the news are stories associating Black men with violence and immigrants with crime, and those narratives start to feel true, even when they aren't supported by data. Let's take a simple example. When a white suspect commits a crime, the media often portrays them as troubled or mentally ill. But when a Black suspect commits a crime, the language is often harsher: thug, criminal, dangerous. Even mugshots versus high school graduation photos can tell 2 very different stories. So, what can we do? We need to become active consumers of media rather than passive ones. Next time you see a news report, ask yourself, who is telling the story? What words are being used? And how are different racial groups represented? And most importantly, what is being left out? Try this. Over the next week, analyze one news article or social media post and look for patterns. Are certain groups being framed in a more negative or positive light? Share your thoughts in our discussion forum. One of the most effective ways to reduce bias is through direct contact with people outside of our usual social circles. Psychologists call this the intergroup contact hypothesis. The idea that the more we interact with people from different backgrounds, the less we rely on stereotypes. Ever notice how people with little exposure to a certain racial or cultural group are often the ones with the most extreme biases? Studies show that meaningful personal interactions, not just knowing of, but actually knowing people from different groups, can dramatically reduce prejudice. So here's a question for you. How diverse is your social circle? If you look at your 5 closest friends, do they all come from similar backgrounds? Expanding your circle isn't about tokenism. It's about authentic engagement and actively seeking perspectives outside of your own. Over the next week, find a way to engage with someone outside of your typical social bubble. It could be attending a cultural event, joining a discussion group, or even just striking up a conversation with someone from a different background. The more we engage, the more we grow. The final strategy is also the hardest, speaking up when we encounter bias. This could be in a meeting, in a classroom, or even in casual conversations with friends and family. Let's say a coworker makes an offhand remark like, "Oh, you're so articulate," to a black colleague, implying surprise at their intelligence. What do? You could ignore it, laugh it off, or you could respond with something simple like, "What do you mean by that?" Sometimes just asking a question forces people to confront their own biases. Speaking up doesn't always mean confrontation. Sometimes it's as simple as redirecting a conversation, offering an alternative perspective, or encouraging deeper thinking. Remember, every time we challenge bias, we create a ripple effect. Bias isn't just about individuals. It's about the systems we participate in. But here's the good news. Systems can change. And that change starts with awareness, reflection, and daily action. This week, I challenge you to notice bias when it happens. In media, in conversations, in decision making. And when you do, take a moment to pause and ask yourself, where did this belief come from? Because the first step towards change is awareness. Next week, we'll go deeper into the historical roots of racism and criminality. How did these biases become so deeply embedded in society? Well, let's find out.